Hello everyone. Later this month, the Governor-General David Johnston will be signing into law Canada's new riding boundaries. This officially creates the 30 new seats in the House of Commons and 30 new MPs starting at the 2015 general election. And what we're going to look at today is why we're having this change in the makeup of the House of Commons, as well as the impact that this will have on the shape of Canadian politics. Now, there are two reasons why we are looking at boundary changes. First, because of the census, which happens every 5 years. And as we learn how population changes in various parts of the country, we need to make sure that the Canadian ridings fairly represent the population changes, as particularly differences in population change across the country. But also there's been a change on how seats are actually allocated to each of the provinces themselves. On average, we would expect to see just under 1 MP for every 100,000 Canadians across each of the 10 provinces. We're not counting the territories in this because they're governed by their own set of rules. But for the provinces, just less than 1 MP for every 100,000 Canadians. And what I would expect to see, if on a fair representation basis, is for when we put all the provinces on here, I would expect to see them all not too far from this line. However, what actually happens when we put them there, there's a considerable difference between provinces. We have 3 provinces in particular, Ontario, Alberta, and British Columbia. They are all rather underrepresented relative to the national average, which 10% for each of these provinces is how far they are below that fair representation point. Quebec is actually more or less spot on fair representation at that 1 MP per 100,000 Canadian mark. However, if we look at the prairies and we look at Atlantic Canada, we can see that all of these are significantly overrepresented relative to the national average. We've got Manitoba, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, all in the 1.2 to 1.5 range. Prince Edward Island in particular, the most overrepresented province, they have 4 MPs for 145,000 people. That on a per capita basis is twice any other province, twice Saskatchewan, which comes at number 2, and 3 times that national average. And if we use the same formula to allocate seats for 2015 based on those census results, we see very little change in terms of the per capita, or the differences in the per capita representation. The reason for this is simply a result of how the formula works. So there are 2 parts to the formula. The first part allocates a fixed number of seats, 279, proportionally across the provinces based on their population. So as a result of that, we'd expect faster growing provinces to gain seats, slower growing provinces to lose seats. Now, the faster growing provinces are gaining seats proportional to that population change and that 279 base. However, the second part of the formula actually prevents provinces from being able to lose seats. So the slower growing provinces, which you would expect to lose seats, they are actually getting an extra top-up to keep them at the level where they were before. So as a result, they're getting a higher per capita representation, a higher representation than their province would mathematically demand. Now, how the formula is changing is that we are, instead of having a fixed base at 279, the base is actually being increased gradually over time, not as quickly as the population, but enough so that the smaller growing provinces probably wouldn't lose any seats as a result of just the base reallocation. The extra top-up to make sure you don't lose seats is still there, but that base, the increase of the base, this would probably be enough to prevent any loss of seats anyway. So we can see that the fair representation mark has moved over slightly. All of the currently overrepresented provinces are staying unchanged in terms of their per capita representation. But all of the provinces that were underrepresented before they're gradually coming closer to that fair representation arc. Quebec is practically right on it, and the other provinces, BC, Ontario, Alberta, are now about 7 or 8% below it rather than the 10% they were before. And if we look further out into the future, 2035 is the furthest out that Statistics Canada has population estimates on a province-by-province basis. We can see the Atlantic provinces are moving towards that fair representation point. And in fact, Prince Edward Island, you probably noticed, got significantly smaller. And the provinces which are currently underrepresented, they're also gradually approaching that line. And they're getting a greater representation. Manitoba actually comes really close to that line, which is a lot better as opposed to the great overrepresentation they had before. But you see gradually over time, we would expect to see, probably by the latter half of the century, most of the provinces within a very narrow band of that point of fair representation. So how do these 30 new seats that are being created actually affect the makeup of the House of Commons? Well, what I've done is I've taken the 2011 results, I've unscrambled all the votes, and I've placed them in the new riding boundaries. And as a result, I came up with this notional result. Using the new boundaries, we have the Conservatives on 189 seats altogether. That's well above the 170 that you now need for an overall majority. So 189 for the Conservatives, the NDP in a comfortable second on 108, the Liberals on 36, and the Bloc Québécois on 4, and the Green Party still on 1. And looking at how that changes from the actual result, the Conservatives are gaining 23 out of the 30 new seats in the House of Commons. That's not surprising on two fronts. First, the law of averages. If you already have a majority of seats and new ones are created, it's not unreasonable to expect a majority of those new seats. On top of that, if you look at where the new seats are being created, that's those underrepresented provinces I mentioned earlier, Alberta, Ontario, BC. Those are provinces where the Conservatives happened to do really well at the last general election. So that gives them an extra column. So 23 seats were gained for the Conservatives. The NDP gained 5 seats as a result of boundary changes. The Liberals gained 2, and the Bloc Québécois and the Greens each remain unchanged. Now, each of the provinces has to take a look at their boundary changes. Even though a province may not be gaining seats, the population shifts within a province may lead for some of the boundaries to shift slightly. And so if we look at how things are changing on a province-by-province basis, we have Newfoundland is the only thing that's changing in Atlantic Canada. There's 1 seat changing from the Liberals to the Conservatives. Other than that, the rest of the maritime provinces staying unchanged in terms of their notional result. 3 seats being created in Quebec, and 1 of them is going to each of the 3 main parties there. In Ontario, we have the Conservatives getting 10 out of the 15 new seats in that province. Most of the new seats being created are in Greater Toronto, the 905 area, that's Durham, York, Peel, and into Niagara. These are typically battleground regions, but it's regions where the Conservatives did really well in 2011. The NDP picking up a few seats in the prairies in Manitoba and Saskatchewan at the expense of the Liberals and the Conservatives. No prizes for guessing where the 6 new seats in Alberta went, all of them going to the Conservatives. Interestingly, is in British Columbia. Only 6 new seats are being created in the Western Province. However, the Conservatives are gaining 7 seats as a result of the boundary changes, and the NDP are actually losing a seat as a result of this. If we look at where the new seats are being created, they're all being created in and around Metro Vancouver, so Richmond, Surrey, Delta, Mission, those kinds of areas. And in particular, I want to mention Burnaby. The NDP managed to win all of the seats in Burnaby at the last election. However, if you look at how the ridings are being drawn in that area, the Burnaby ridings are getting a lot of conservative voters from the old riding of North Vancouver. And as a result, one of those Burnaby seats is switching over and becoming notionally conservative. So hence where that -1 comes from. Now to find out the overall impact that this has on the future balance of power, we're going to take a look at the book BDC and the swingometer. The swingometer is meant to measure the impact that swing has, how the swing between one party and another impacts the parliamentary makeup. So, for example, if we have a 5% swing from Conservative to NDP, that means if we take 100 voters, 5 of them would change their vote from Conservative to the NDP. Now the vertical here represents no change. Everyone voted exactly as they did. If we see a swing to the Conservatives, no surprise, that would just mean a stronger Conservative majority. But if we swing the other way, we swing away from Conservatives and towards the NDP, what we gradually expect to see is the Conservatives losing their majority and then gradually the NDP forming the government on their own. Now, using the actual results from the 2011 election, we would expect the NDP to take away the Conservatives' majority with a swing of around 4%. That's assuming, of course, that that swing is uniform across the country. 4% would be enough for the NDP to take enough seats to take away their Conservatives' majority, and 4% swing isn't uncommon in a general election scenario. But the swing that they would need to form a government of their own is closer to 10%. 10% swing is quite a huge ask. It's the kind of swing that the NDP took away from the Liberals in 2011. And that kind of swing doesn't happen very often. But it's an even greater swing for the NDP to take a majority of their own. They would need a 13% swing against the Conservatives in order to form their own majority government. Now that's with the actual result. Let's see how things change with the seat boundary changes. What we see is that the Conservatives have a little bit more protection of their majority. The swing the NDP needs to take away goes up from 4% to about 5.5%. So that's an extra 1.5% buffer. But for the NDP to take a government, both on a minority and majority basis, that stays practically unchanged at that 10 and 13% marks. And we see a very similar phenomenon for the Liberals. In fact, it's slightly easier for the Liberals to take away the Conservatives' majority than it is for the NDP, just because of that large number of Liberal Conservative battleground seats in southern Ontario. So the Liberals only need a swing of around 1.5% in order to take away the Conservative majority. However, if they want to form a government of their own, because of the low base they're starting at, they need a colossal swing of 17%, just over 17%, in order just to form a minority government. The swingometer stops at 20, so in order to get a majority, they need well above that. So, and if we look at how things change with the boundary changes, very similar phenomenon. Conservatives have slightly larger insurance. So the Liberals now need to swing around 3.5%. That's an extra 2% swing buffer for the Conservatives. However, for the Liberals to form their own government, the swing they need actually comes down slightly, but negligibly so. So ultimately, the takeaway here is that these boundary changes give the Conservatives a little bit of extra insurance for their existing majority, but once that majority is gone, then they have no extra insurance against either the Liberals or the NDP forming a government of their own. Finally, let's take a look at what things would look like if there were a general election today. Using a weighted average of recent opinion polls, if there were a general election around now, we would expect to see the Liberals gaining enough seats to form a minority government, finishing on 150 seats altogether. That's 20 seats short of what they need for a majority. and it is off the Liberal leader Justin Trudeau's peak. At one point, he would be looking at 190 seats shortly after he became Liberal leader. However, to go from 36 to 150, quadrupling your seat count, doubling your opinion poll figures, that doesn't happen very often. And now, how much of this support is part of the honeymoon that any party leader gets at the beginning of their premiership, that still remains to be seen. However, it's still quite remarkable to see 150 seats for a party that got decimated at the 2011 election. The Conservatives is finishing in second place on 124. They lose a third of their MPs, mostly in Ontario. Again, that huge battleground in the Greater Toronto area. The Liberals making huge gains in that part of the province. The NDP also losing a significant number of MPs. They're down to around 63 seats. Again, that's because the Liberals are actually making huge gains. In fact, they're doing better in Quebec than they are in other parts of the country. And of course, the NDP having a huge tidal wave in Quebec in 2011, the Liberals are taking a lot of those new NDP seats for themselves. The Green Party leader Elizabeth May would keep her seat in Saint Michel Province. Noticeably absent here, though, is the Bloc Québécois. They only have 4 seats in the House of Commons at the moment. Remember, they did manage to get 59 out of the 75 seats in the 2008 election. However, most of them got wiped out with the NDP wave in 2011, and all of what's left is being eaten up by the Liberal wave that's happening in Quebec now as a result of Justin Trudeau's premiership. So, what this means for the Bloc Québécois and its leader Daniel Payet, well, it's too early to say. However, the Liberal minority is where we would be if there were an election right now. It's too early to say if Justin Trudeau will be able to keep that kind of support all the way into 2015. Remember, 2 years is a lifetime in politics. However, if he is able to keep that kind of support, then that will lead to our first Liberal Prime Minister in nearly a decade, and possibly the biggest comeback in Canadian political history.